Good evening, everyone. My name is Julian Zepeda. I am the program coordinator here at International House. I just want to extend my sincere gratitude for all of you being here this evening and Dr. Conn for speaking at this very wonderful topic. So before we get started, I just wanted to introduce what the Global Forum is. It is a program that is through our International House Programs and Events Office, and it fosters a globally oriented community by offering international topics and conversations on cultural observances here to students. So in other words, we bring the global community here to the domestic population. That all being said, there will be a survey along with a QR code to our link tree at the end of this presentation, and I invite you to check out what other programs we have this quarter and the following quarters. Now, we will welcome to the stage the School of Global Policy professor and director of the Cowhey Center on Global Transformation, Joshua Graff, to the podium. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. It's great to see many familiar faces. It's great to see some new faces. I'm Josh Graf-Zivin. I have the good fortune of being the director of the Cowhey Center on Global Transformation. For those of you who don't know the center is focused on issues around the ways in which science and technology transform economic outcomes, political lives, and how political and economic forces shape scientific and innovative forces in our economy. So you'll be unsurprised by the topic we have to talk about tonight. I want to start by thanking everyone who's here for coming out tonight. I want to thank those of you who are regulars at our events. We appreciate your support and your participation. I want to offer a special thanks to Joan and Erwin Jacobs, who are the supporters of this center, who have been steadfast with us for many, many years. We really appreciate all the support, and we're delighted to be here tonight. Before we get to the main event here, I want to do a little shameless plugging. We have 3 more GLF events coming up in the not-so-distant future. We have Atano Chakraborty, former Secretary of the Department of Economic Affairs in India, is going to join us the first week of January. Juan Carlos Jobet, who's Dean of the University of Adolfo Ibáñez in Chile, and is also the former Minister of Energy for Chile. And finally, in February, we're going to have Harvey Feinberg, President of the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, former President of the Institute of Medicine, and someone who is very interested in many of the themes that we're going to be hearing about tonight. So please join us for those. We'll be sending out blast emails with all the details to register and the rest, but wanted to put that on your calendars. A couple of housekeeping items before introducing Bob. First, we're gonna hear from Bob for about a half an hour or so, followed by question and answer session. So please jot down notes if you must, but we're gonna let Bob have the stage uninterrupted for a spell, and then we're gonna open it up to questions and answers. From you guys, we encourage your participation. That will be followed by a light reception right here at the back of the room. Okay, so now the main event. We're going to give you the condensed biography on Bob because otherwise I'd use all of his half an hour just to describe all the things he's done in his life. Robert W. Conn, Bob, to those of us who spend time with them, is the former president and CEO of the Kavli Foundation, a nonprofit organization with a mission to advance science for the benefit of humanity. He retired at the end of 2020 after serving 12 years in this role. He's also the co-founder of the Science Philanthropy Alliance and served as board chair from 2015 to 2019. He was the dean of the Erwin and Joan Jacobs School of Engineering here at UC San Diego from 94 to 2002. He guided the Jacobs School from its humble beginnings to its rather laudable accomplishments that we all know and love. There's much more to say about Bob. I will just conclude on one personal note. Bob's going to talk about a project that I have sort of loosely been collaborating with him on, as has Peter Cowhey sitting here in the front. And it has been a tremendous pleasure to speak with Bob and work with Bob and learn from Bob. I feel like I've really learned an awful lot in this process, and I'm immensely grateful for that. So Bob, the floor is all yours.
Well, it's delightful for me to be here and to do this. There you see who I have been doing whatever I'm going to talk about with. So Peter Cowhey is the distinguished former dean of the School of Global Policy and Strategy, and he's made it, in my mind, into what it is. Tremendous legacy left behind. Josh Graf-Siffen is a very distinguished economist. Now remember, I'm a scientist and an engineer. I don't spend a lot of time with economists and political scientists. So working with these folks has been a thrill. And I haven't had an opportunity earlier in life to do it, and it's been a tremendous 3 years. So maybe it's reciprocal, right, Josh? And Chris Martin, I want to mention, because Chris is our data guru, and a lot of the data that you will see come from Chris Martin. Chris was the vice president for science programs at the Cowhey Foundation when I was president, and so I've known him a long time. He wanted to try to do some other things and was at loose ends, and I grabbed him and got him into about a year after we got going. And so he's been part of this for at least 2/3 of the time. And what I'm going to talk to you about, for me, is maybe 7 years in the making. I started to think about it because I was president of a science-based foundation. What's the role of philanthropy in science? And is it big? Is it small? Does it make any difference? And so on and so forth. So I've been at this a while, wrote a seminal paper, I hope, in 2021. And that led us to the project you're going to hear about tonight. So what I want to do is take 30, 35 minutes. I've broken this down into 5 or 6 biteable chunks. So part 1, part 2, part 3, with only 3 or 4 slides per part, so that we can really get through it. And I hope I can get across to you in the time available the essential points of what we've discovered as we go on. So the first part of this is really to set the framework for what I want to discuss in the other parts of the talk. And this framework goes back to 2018, 2019, and was presented at a major conference at the National Academies in 2020. In fact, just before COVID. It was a celebration of the 75th anniversary of the famous Vannevar Bush Science, the Endless Frontier report. Vannevar Bush was President Roosevelt's science advisor during World War II. So the topic here is the evolution of science and higher education and the roles of government and philanthropy over what I've laid out to be 4 epochs of American history. They fall in these categories. We have our industrial age, not much science. Ben Franklin, think of Ben Franklin. That was science in those days. But starting with the Industrial Revolution, things really changed. And that began in 1840. I got a little bit of bars up there so that you don't have an exact date. But right around 1860, there's no question we're in an industrial age. And unfortunately, we're also in the middle of a civil war. But by the end of the Civil War, a lot of the railroad building, the this, the that, the other thing that took place in the 1850s and 1860s created a group of wealthy people the country had never seen before. Names like Rockefeller and Carnegie and many others that you're familiar with. And there was great social turmoil about the split between the very wealthy and the average person. But what developed, at least one aspect of what developed, was that some of those people decided that giving back was very important. Giving back to society enabled me to get the wealth I have an obligation to give it back. And that's Carnegie's gospel of wealth, by the way. So through the 1870s, you start to get new private universities forming on the landscape in the United States. We never had it. The private universities up to that point were religious organizations. Harvard was a divinity school, Yale was a divinity school, Princeton, and so on. So suddenly, universities are being created And they're built on what I would remark is the German model of higher education. And let me come back to that in the next slide. So the main point is you have this wealth that generates a whole new infrastructure of education in the United States, something that to this day has given the United States a distinctive advantage in the world, the greatest university system ever. And it's because it's private universities and public universities melded into this enormous educational and research enterprise. If you go on to the right, we enter into a manufacturing age. I think of Sloan and the Sloan Foundation. Sloan put together General Motors, Henry Ford, and that sort of thing. You get into a manufacturing age and an industrial age. And that goes on in and through the 1970s. There are some major discoveries, like the transistor in 1947, but this is fundamentally a manufacturing age. And in 1945, at the end of World War II, this famous report was written, and it changed everything about higher education in the United States. The essence of it was the government should not, in fact, spend research money that we had shown was so important during the war, from radar, obviously the atomic bomb, et cetera. The natural tendency of government would have been to do that research in military research laboratories. No. Do it at the universities of the country. Build up their graduate programs. And why? You'll get the staffing that you need for the rest of the economy, including defense. You'll build up a research enterprise that might be parallel to none, and it will drive the economy and jobs. Those things turned out to be prescient and true. That is, looking back at history, that's what, in fact, happened. And so we go on out to this period, and the government becomes very keen on the support of higher education and research. And in fact, some philanthropies that have been extremely active in supporting science before World War II, like the Rockefeller Foundation, suddenly said, it's the government's job. The government is doing all this work. And they actually closed down the science program of the Rockefeller Foundation in the 1960s. Come to 1990, and you see that philanthropy is at first reduced, but then science philanthropy reemerges in this last epoch, Epoch 4. And that epoch I describe as a digital information age. We had two revolutions in the 1990s, both the internet and the wireless revolution, simultaneously. We'd never had that before. And the impact on the economy and on society have been enormous ever since. But a couple of other things happened around 1980 that are important for me to describe. If you look at the university part back in the 1850s to 1890s, first, there was the Morrill Act of 1862. And that is the basis of the public land grant universities, most of which turned out to be our great public universities. That's how University of California was founded on the basis of being a land grant university. And some private universities, like Irwin's alma mater, Cornell, is also a land grant university because it had a great program in agriculture. In any case, suddenly after World War II, you start seeing universities being founded by people of wealth. Johns Hopkins was the first in 1871. Vanderbilt in Tennessee, 1873. Vanderbilt, the railroad tycoon. Leland Stanford found Stanford University in 1885. The University of Chicago is founded on a gift from Rockefeller. But it's Rockefeller wealth making the University of Chicago the great school you know today. Carnegie did Carnegie Tech. Mellon did Mellon. Eventually they became Carnegie Mellon. Rice, even into the 1920s. Duke was founded in 1924 based on the legacy of James Duke. So this giving back created the private university system we know today. And that's a powerful impact. During and before World War II, I got to put this somewhere. Josh, can I give this to you and you give it back to me when I need it? Thank you. Prior to World War II, the government, in fact, did not fund scientific research. We're so used to thinking of the federal government funding scientific research that it's hard to imagine it didn't at one time. But in fact, only until World War II did the government start funding science, both at laboratories and at university. So after the war, federal support for science dominates. And that's the reason I said philanthropic support starts to decrease. But then again, as I say, around 1980, I'm going to talk about it next, something transformative actually occurs. And it's not just in business, it's in finance and it's in investment. And those changes lead us to the age we're in today, which I would say science and technology is fully global. And in 2020, the support for science is multifaceted. It's not just the federal government. And I'll get to that. So this is the last of these framing slides. And what I really want to focus on is, why is there this transition between Epoch 3 and Epoch 4? What caused that? It's not magical. It didn't happen as a natural matter of the marketplace. It's very important. It in fact happened in the latter part of the Jimmy Carter administration, of all people, because we don't always think of Jimmy Carter as having accomplished what he might have accomplished. But this all comes during his time as president. And three fundamental things happened that enabled the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. One was a change in the capital gains rate. That might seem trivial, but when you form, and I did venture capital, when you form a venture capital firm, the partners are partners of a limited liability corporation, and they have what's called carried interest. At the end of the fund, they not only have gotten their salaries, but they get a payout if they have winners. Big payout. How is it taxed? Turns out it's taxed as a capital gain, not as income. And that's a big deal, and it's still that way today, 40 or 50 years later. The second is the most important change, and that's the prudent investor rule. In 1979, and you remember Carter's the guy who deregulated the airlines. So he was interested in deregulation. And they changed the rule about investment pools for large pools of money. So if you were the manager of a pension fund for the fireman or the policeman or whomever, you were constrained in what you could invest in. For example, if you invested in some startup company in Silicon Valley, and there were a few in those days, like Intel, if Intel had failed instead of winning, you could be sued for fiduciary irresponsibility. And it didn't matter if you had a portfolio of 10 or 12 such investments. And having done venture capital, 8 of them are going to fail, or at most return money. 3 or 4 will make the whole fund, but it doesn't matter. If a few failed, you could be sued. The prudent investor rule said, we're changing this. The idea now is a portfolio look at what a manager is doing. So you can have a portfolio, and it can have bonds, relatively safe, and then stocks and bonds. And often these funds are 50% stocks and bonds. But then you could have other things like private equity and venture capital. And so long as the venture capital part, which is the highest risk part of your asset classes, doesn't exceed 10 or 15% of the total portfolio, it's fine. And in fact, everybody gooses the returns from university endowments through their investments in venture capital and private equity. So the final part was the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980 that allowed universities to own the discoveries that they made, even if they were supported by federal government. And that allowed tech transfer to be greased. But the most important in my mind was the prudent investor rule change. And if you look now at the 1980s and 1990s, The number of private equity and venture capital firms not quadrupled, not tripled, factors of 10, 20. By the 1990s, there were 20 times as many VC firms as there were in 1980. And private equity, the modern version of private equity, was created in the 1980s because of these rule changes. You could now go raise capital. So Pete Peterson, who had been Reagan's Secretary of the Treasury, went out and founded Blackstone Group, 1983. And you can see, Bain Capital, some names you may know, Carlyle Group. They were all founded in the 1980s. And there's a reason. The reason is what I said. They weren't founded in the 70s or the 60s or the 50s. They couldn't find a large enough pool of funds. All right, so that's the framing. And we're living in this Epoch 4. And in that context, let me just do a little overview of science, its nature, its scale, and who does it. So this is a chart, very complicated. Don't get frightened. It's okay. It's okay. Donald Stokes created this kind of thing at the Brookings Institute in 1997. All I'd ask you to do is focus on the upper two quadrants, the upper left and the upper right. The upper left is called the Bohr quadrant after Niels Bohr. But it could have been named the Einstein quadrant, or you name your most famous scientist who just wanted to understand how nature works. They're not thinking about making money. They're not thinking about solving some problem. They just want to understand how nature works. Niels Bohr is the discoverer of the atom. The hydrogen in the middle with the electron going around side. That's the Bohr model of the atom, 1912. So that upper quadrant is what is called curiosity-driven research. Sometimes that sounds effete or elite. It just means you really just want to understand the world. And there's nothing bad about that. The National Science Foundation defines that as basic research when they calculate how much money gets spent on different kinds of research. There's also very fundamental work, I would say basic research, motivated differently. And that's the upper right-hand corner. There, people want to solve a problem, and they don't have the fundamental understanding of science and nature to solve it. The classic example that everybody uses, so I'll use it too, is the transistor. Now, the world we live in is because we have transistors. Prior to 1947, we didn't have transistors. And AT&T didn't know what it was going to do because it had a network and it was powered with vacuum tubes, and vacuum tubes are very unreliable and they consume a lot of energy. What to do? And a group started in the early 1940s going through the periodic table. And they eventually discovered a set of materials that turned out to have this property of a transistor. They got the Nobel Prize for this discovery, and they reported it first in 1947. And so that changed the world. We're living in the transistor age. Chips are transistors. So, great breakthrough, right? But they weren't just looking, how does nature work? They were trying to really solve a problem. And it's called Pasteur's quadrant because that was what drove Pasteur. How do I get the milk that children drink to be healthy? Pasteurization, right? Before that, you could get sick. How do you get rid of the germs and stuff like that? And it was built on a germ theory of disease. So that's the nature of the scientific endeavor. There's the fundamental, both are fundamental, but one is curiosity-driven to understand, and the other is driven by the desire to solve a really important problem. What do we spend? Well, here's a list of spending by country. You can see that the United States spends the most, and also in percentages, at least up to now, we've spent almost 15% of that $800 billion on basic research and about 18% on applied research. So it's very significant. And in fact, if you look down the list, The only two that come close percentage-wise are Korea and Taiwan. And who does the work? Well, if you look at this, you'll see who the performers are. So federal intramural is a fancy way of saying the NIH, for example. Agencies that are federal agencies that are set up to do research. The FFRDC, that's federally funded research and development centers. That's your national laboratories, Argonne National Lab, Fermi Lab, Oak Ridge National Laboratory, Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. All of those are federally funded R&D centers funded by the government. Very little is done non-federal government. You look over at business, it does a lot of basic and applied, and the basic is in blue and the applied is in orange. But if you look at higher education, it swamps everything. And that's our university system. And if you look at the final thing, that's the Salk Institute across the road. You know, a nonprofit research organization like Salk, Cold Spring Harbor, places of that kind. So the performers are fundamentally the university system and the nonprofit research organizations for basic and applied research. So that took a little bit, but it sets the stage. And we discovered, as we dug and dug and dug and dug, two central findings, and I just want to stick with those two and no more. One is the scale of science philanthropy. It turns out in 2022 dollars, philanthropy of all kinds, direct giving, let me define a term, legacy philanthropy. I coined that to reference the payout from the endowments of all of the universities. That's giving in the past that built up the endowment, and every year you get 5% paid out. So that's legacy philanthropy. And then there are other, but that all adds up, what also universities spend on themselves, to $22 billion a year. $22 billion a year is 42% of what the federal government spends. The federal government doesn't truly dominate basic and applied research. 40% is coming out of philanthropy, both past and current. Now, if you're not surprised by that, I'm surprised, because we were surprised. Nobody thinks it's that large, and that's really the fundamental finding. The other thing is, you look at research and development, basic and applied, over the years. This goes back to 1953. But what's important is look at 2000 to 2022. You see the black line is the ever-rising line. That's the total. The blue line is the federal government, and the red line's philanthropy. And since about 2005, the blue line's been basically flat. The rise in the black line is due to philanthropy. So without philanthropy, we would be in deeper trouble than we're already in. And I think that indicates how important science philanthropy is to the whole enterprise of our discovery system and our economic system in the United States. Now, what are the characteristics? So I've given you a framing. I've explained what the big results are. The other thing that's important is that these different sources of funding have different characteristics. For example, they take different levels of risk. The federal government is much less willing to take the levels of risk than philanthropies are. I can tell you that from personal experience. I can tell you that from having studied it. So how do these different things differ? Government, business, and philanthropy. The first is risk-taking and innovation. And I want to just give you a personal example. As president of the Cowhey Foundation, if I saw something that a scientist had done on a visit to places where we were supporting science, and I thought that was a breakthrough idea, I could give them $300,000 in a week. And they could go about finding out whether there was a pony in that. Think about going to the federal government with a wild and crazy idea. Forget it. It's very simple. Forget it. That is what I mean by a different level of risk. You can take really fundamental ideas from great people who think they might change the world, but they can't prove it. The support will come from philanthropy. I can tell you as dean of the great Jacobs School of Engineering, and I'll come back to this, I could make decisions with the payout from the endowment and resources that we were getting from Irwin and Joan Jacobs. I made decisions I could never make as a dean just with university money. Now, the Jacobs School's ranked 9. When I got here in 1993, it was ranked 44. When I left, it was ranked 11. It's still ranked 9. So it's in the top 10. In large part, it's because it has the largest endowment of any private university, any public university in the country. And that's due to Irwin and Joan. So it really makes a difference. Flexibility and speed, I implied, but it's true, okay? And this is very important. The backers of people running foundations, or the founders themselves, have different ideas about what to support. And it's much more diverse than the standard things you see at the federal level. So what does it do? It adds risk and new ideas at the edges of our knowledge, right? It expands the sphere. Don't underestimate how powerful that is. Human capital. Peter has been a big contributor to this in our conversations. Philanthropy really enables institutions to experiment with the best ways to invest the resources they've got in order to develop people or go in some new direction that they weren't going in. They can't do that by going to the federal government and say, I want to do sustainability. Please support me. But if they can find a donor who will endow a school of sustainability, they can move on their own in directions they want to go. So that's very powerful. And finally, the last 2 points are very similar. Philanthropy is a source that often does not totally prescribe what you need to do with the money. You have freedom. And that freedom is institutional freedom. It means that the universities can develop in ways that they might not develop solely dependent on government funding. And so support for independence of our research institutions is crucial. And the major source of that money is philanthropy. The other is that, and I credit both Josh and Peter for this, there's sort of an implicit division of labor in the basic and applied research areas in terms of who supports what. And it has to do with scale. So if you have a project that needs $50 or $100 million a year, that's going to get funded by the government, or it's going to get funded by a business who's betting the business on the outcome of that work. Google just had 2 artificial intelligence scientists working in chemistry win the Nobel Prize. Years ago, it would have been Bell Labs. Now it's Google. Transformative, right? It's very different today than it was 50 years ago. And universities and NPOs undertake projects with, as I've implied all along, broader risk than government or business themselves would take. Remember, research and development supported by business is supported so that the business will be better 10 years from now or 2 years from now. They have a goal. Their job is to deliver results for their shareholders. And they can only do that by staying focused. They can't afford to go off and support Niels Bohr, okay? But philanthropy can. And the government sometimes does too. So this is coming to the end. One of the distinctions I mentioned to you of the first Gilded Age was the founding by wealthy folks of private universities, and I gave you a list. What's happening today is we're not founding new private universities. We're funding major new schools within private universities. For example, Stephen Schwarzman, the head of Blackstone Group, gave $350 million to MIT for their new College of Computing. And there's alignment. This is important too. MIT wanted a new College of Computing. They went out to find somebody who would back them up. They didn't do what the donor wanted. They did what they wanted and found a donor who would partner with them. So don't think the philanthropist always drives exactly what you do. They don't. You can think clearly, and if you can make the case to a philanthropist, it's remarkable how they react. So mega gifts are what I define as greater than $100 million. These were the gifts that I mentioned in the first Gilded Age, so back in Epoch 2. And you can see how any number of them are more than $1 billion. Both Rockefeller University and the University of Chicago, translated to current dollars. Big money, big money. Today, these are mega gifts that are establishing new directions universities want to go in. I'm going to start at the bottom because I was Dean of Engineering here when Irwin and Joan Jacobs decided that they would endow the school. This was 1998. And between 1998 and 2002, they committed of the order $125 million. And I've told you that has made an extraordinary difference, not just to me, but my successors. And we're on my second or third successor, and they're all using the legacy and resources that come from this gift. Harvard and MIT benefited from Eli and Edith Broad, the housing builder, $600 million to establish the Broad Institute in Biological Sciences. Challenges to solve these days. Michael Bloomberg has done something quite different. He's supporting tuition. So he gave two gifts, $1.8 billion and $1.2 billion. One supports all the tuition for undergraduates at Johns Hopkins University. You can go there for free. Doesn't matter, wealthy or not. And if you want to go to med school, that's paid for. So it's not just new schools. It's enabling people who don't always have the means to find their way within the system. And I mentioned Schwartzman's gift to MIT. And the last two up there are in the area of environmental and sustainability, climate included. My alma mater, Caltech, needed something to get them really into environmental sustainability, and the Resnicks gave them $750 million. And John and Ann Dorr, John Dorr is the lead partner at the venture capital firm Klein & Perkins in the Valley. He gave $1.1 billion just 2 years ago to create a school of sustainability at Stanford. Now, Stanford wanted a school of sustainability, and they managed to find somebody who wanted the same thing, believed in what such a school could do for humanity. And these kind of investments are 50 years, 80-year investments. They're not just for 5 or 10 years. So let me close with what are the implications for China? And I do this with some trepidation, having Susan Shirk in the room, the great China scholar of UC San Diego, for those who don't know. Really, this is what are the implications of philanthropy in the United States as being such a distinctive feature relative to the competition issues we may face between the United States and China. So that's the premise. That's the question. I showed you this slide, and no matter how you measure the metric of the United States and China, on a per capita basis, on a unit of GDP basis, we still lead. And there's no reason we won't be able, with this level of resources, to sustain leadership in the future. But there are some caveats that I'm going to come back to. So how is China's system of science, technology, engineering, medicine, how does it differ from ours? Well, what is the characteristics of their system? I showed you something like this. And what you could see is that in higher education and private nonprofit, it dominates what goes on in higher education in China. So who's performing, right? R&D in China and the United States as of 2021. We have an advantage at the moment. It's ours to keep or give up or lose. Here are the characteristics of China, and we had 2 Kavli institutes in China, so I spent a lot of time there. My fundamental statement is China's a top-down system, don't ever forget it. I was there when the 2 great technical universities, the University of Peking and Tsinghua, on the same day in 2015 had the presidents fired, summarily by Xi, at the top of the government. The government runs the university. It was sending a signal. Make sure you control those campuses. And that was stunning. Nobody expected it. It came out of the blue. So it's an example of what happens in a top-down system. Now, there are advantages. You can set up a national strategy and you can align them at every level. You can architect solutions at the national level, and you can often do it more rapidly. Regional governments in China support a lot of science and technology, and they do it more than we do, although, of course, we have state universities, and that's a lot of support. China has a very large population. So they're going to keep educating and growing the number of people who are going into science and technology over the years. And that is an advantage we don't have. They don't need immigration. We need immigration. We have not survived without immigration to our graduate schools in the United States. It's a fundamental distinction. And here are characteristics of our system. I like the top line. It's a bottoms-up driven, investigator-driven system, not top-down. Philanthropy plays a large and differentiating role. There's no way philanthropy plays that kind of a role in China because the government will tell the rich what to do with their money. The federal government has less oversight of university and NPOs, although we've just seen recently some difficulties in that regard from Congress and resigning of presidents. I would say US researchers have a greater degree of freedom to pursue curiosity-inspired things. And I remarked, we rely on immigration for the human staffing of the science and technology enterprise of this country. And to the degree that we don't allow people in, we shoot ourselves in the foot. And so ultimately, there's a broad diversity of scientific research and the diversity of sources of funding in the United States that I think yield the feedstock for the US innovation economy. So my conclusion is today we do have structural advantages in the US system that could help us prevail in the long run. But, and maybe the but is more important after November than not. The but is this can change over time, and it really does require a consistent, forward-looking national policy at the federal level with respect to basic and applied research. And if you tamper with that, you tamper with your future. Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right, so normally when we do these things, the person sitting in my seat kicks us off with a question, but Bob and I have had lots of questions and answers, so I'm not sure I need to take the interrogator's prerogative here. I've noticed lots of people sitting in the audience with rapt attention, so I will, if no one shoots a hand up, I will certainly indulge myself, but I wanted to open it up to the floor to see if folks had questions for Bob. And I see a bunch already. Curtis is walking around with a microphone.
So that was really fascinating, Bob. Thank you so much. So I gather from the time you spent dealing with tax law and that the financial system is really important factor.
Crucial.
And so creating this private wealth, which of course is related to distribution of income here, that has gone back through philanthropy into public goods of research, mostly at universities. Do you see any risk factors in our future on that dimension?
Well, I think one of the risk factors is whether the wealthy will continue to do what they have done historically. That's the fundamental risk factor.
Well, what about,
And-
will they stay
Well,
as wealthy as they
let me
are?
explain just a little bit, Susan. Why is there such wealth? Why is Elon Musk worth what he's worth? Why is Mark Zuckerberg worth what he's worth? Why is Brin and Page worth what they're worth? And you know, it's 40 billion, it's 80 billion, it's 120 billion dollars. We're not talking small money. Why do they have that level of wealth? And it has to do with the venture capital and private equity approach to changing financial rules. So what can happen is, and let me use Google as an example. Larry Page and Sergey Brin were graduate students of computer science at Stanford, you know that. And when they spun out and wanted to start their company, it's a software company. They got backed by some of the most famous venture capital firms in the Valley, Sequoia and Kleiner Perkins. But they actually only needed about 2 rounds of financing. And if you're a software company, it's 10 million first and maybe another 10 or 15 for growth capital after, and you're done. You're cash flow positive and you can drive your company on your own. After those 2 rounds of funding, the founders still own 40% of Google or 50% of Google. They didn't own 5% of Google. I did a capital intensive company in the middle 1980s. I ended up owning 5 or 8% of the company when it went public. Whereas they owned 40 and 50%. That's where the big wealth is coming from. So understanding that that's a financial rule that got changed and enables that wealth to happen. Now, I didn't remark, but it's on the slide, you know, from Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth in 1889. If you die with your wealth, you die poor. Paraphrasing. To the Gates-Buffett pledge 110 years later, pledge to give away half your wealth, at least half your wealth, and many are pledging to give away more. If the wealthy follow the Gates-Buffett pledge model, we'll be fine. But there is a tendency, and I use Elon Musk as the poster child. By the way, he came here as a foreign student to study, right? The benefit of immigration. And he's the wealthiest person in the country today. What's he going to do with his wealth? Well, he's in the middle of running his companies. We were worried about what was Bill Gates going to do in the 1990s. He wasn't giving back. He was running his company. But when he stopped running his company, he transformed what he did. And you know what he does today. Whether that will happen with Elon Musk and others, I don't know. But it has to happen, Susan, with enough people to keep this model of private philanthropy being so important going. If it breaks, okay.
All right, well, Curtis, if you want to walk around, I'll just add, it's not just if it breaks, if the taste of the wealthy for what they'd like to support with their money changes. That's also problematic for the innovation part of the economy.
So I've got 3 interrelated questions.
I'm going to have to remember them.
$48 billion is the NIH budget this year. Almost all of it will go to university medical research. So the first question is, when we looked at your slides, what were we looking at? Second question is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and the NIH future. And the third is the spinoff of your last comment, the Trump administration and the future of philanthropy.
So I'm not going to tackle the second one. Robert F. Kennedy is a poor choice for running the nation's health system. I'm sorry for the nomination. I don't know what the consequences are going to be. We're just going to have to wait and see. With respect to NIH support, it is large, as you say, but the NIH federal government part of it is less than half the number you mentioned. The rest of it goes to universities, the Salk, our biology department, School of Medicine, et cetera. And so the numbers actually are consistent. They can be confusing because some goes to federally funded research intramural, that's NIH, the NIH institutes. Bethesda, basically. And the rest goes to universities and private nonprofits. I'm skipping the middle one.
Thank you for the lecture. Over here.
One over here.
Over here. Yeah, my question is,
Bob, fantastic presentation. 1980 is an interesting date.
For you, I know.
Bayh-Dole is part of that, but
Right.
the preceding 10 years were interesting ones. The president fired 2 science advisors. We were generating lots of Nobel Prizes, but our industry was really falling behind in terms of competition with Japan and Germany. But the 2010 number was, your date 2010 really worries me. The curve of federal funding for basic and applied research, that is not in constant dollars. I assume that's really a drop in
Yeah.
real money for support of
It's been
research.
flat in real dollars, by and large. It's gone up each year, but not enough. So I think it's 2022 dollars and projected back in the same dollars. So it's just been, it's really flat.
I mean, I buy
In
into
absolute dollars every year, if you measured that way, it would in fact,
I buy into your analysis of private giving, but the federal dollars have to keep pace.
okay, so there's no question.
I mean, I'd always thought in terms of 5% of the GDP and I don't know what those percentages are now.
Well, you saw the percentages up there.
Those weren't constant dollars you showed.
But they were, I put the 2022 numbers as percentage of GDP in
Okay.
2022, so.
In any
It's a
event,
little,
it's
it's around
worrisome.
3.5% now, not 5. But your main point is correct. The federal government's funding of basic and applied science has not kept up with the need. And it's being crowded out, as many things are, by the federal debt. So trying to come up with these budgets year over year when the debt is very large has been part of the problem. Now, the Democrats want to deal with it one way and the Republicans may deal with it a different way. But it has been flat, and the only growth has really come net new from the giving of philanthropy since 2010.
You know, it's a small number of universities that are funded heavily for research. And the politics of maintaining that story is worrisome.
Okay, so what Dick has just said, for those who couldn't hear it, the number of universities gaining federal research and development money is relatively small, and that has its own problems. But I would argue to you it's not as small as one thinks. The AAU, the Association of American Universities, now has 71 members. 2 are Canadian, admittedly. But the rest are American. That's 70 universities across the country, from MIT and Harvard in the East to Michigan and Chicago in the Midwest to Colorado and so on, out on to the great campuses of the University of California, plus Stanford and Caltech. So it is reasonably distributed. It's weighted more on the coast, that's true. But there's 70 players in the game. It's not 10.
There are about 5,000 universities in the United States.
But most of those universities are not research universities. That's the distinction. We have a large number of universities that are fundamentally focused on Bryn Mawr and Grinnell College in Iowa and so on. They're about undergraduate education, critically important, right? But they're not research universities. So the idea of comparing 70 to 5,000, I think, is comparing a bit apples and oranges. There are more than 70 research universities and many who want to be part of the AAU. So maybe twice that number. That would be a reasonable, right? Okay.
Yeah, question over here. The numbers for the mega donors are very impressive, like 1.2 million down to the 150 million, et cetera. What impact do the small donations make? Because I would assume there are lots and millions of people who contribute $50, $100, $200. Do those really make a difference?
Yes, yes. And the reason they make a difference, Americans are very generous. Each year, Americans give $300 billion to charity. $300 billion. Now, a lot of that goes to their churches and synagogues and religious groups. A lot of it goes to their local high school or whatever they want to do. But those are the small donors that really do add up. What they don't do is take a university like the University of California here at San Diego and provide enough money for the university to go in a new direction it wants to go in. You can't agglomerate all that money and use it for a particular purpose. Whereas when you have a person who can donate $500 million, $200 million, $1 billion, you can go in a particular direction. And that's what happened at a big university, Stanford, but it also happened at a small university, my alma mater, Caltech. So if you can garner those levels of resources, you can move the needle in where the car is going. But Americans are generous. $300 billion a year is a lot of money.
Hi, question here. So my question, I liked in one of your slides how you showed these epics, and my question...
Say again, start again, please.
I liked how your slide discussed the epics and how the internet and technology has transformed. Now let's look into the future as towards advanced blockchain and cryptography, and what George Gilder, who wrote the book Life After Google, described as the decentralization of the internet, which we know there's some pretty big problems with like Zuckerberg controlling so much of Facebook and the direction of Facebook and how they run their algorithms and all those types of things. Can you comment on how you think the Web 3.0 is going to transform power structure maybe in Silicon Valley and also ramifications?
Well, let me step back a second. What you're fundamentally describing is monopoly. And we have been dealing with monopoly since the first Gilded Age. The trust of Rockefeller and all of the oil companies was the Google, Facebook of their day. And the issue is, how are you going to, at what scale are things too large and they're too much control of the marketplace? There's a lawsuit against Google to try to break it up now. I don't know what's going to happen with Facebook. But it's not the first time that we have ever faced large concentrations of businesses under one roof. What will happen in the future is very hard to tell. And one of the differences, I think artificial intelligence will have and quantum computing to a degree, will be like the internet and wireless communications in the 90s. I mean, it can transform the economy. What you would hope is that new companies come along, like Qualcomm came along in the wireless revolution, a company you never heard of, and really had an opportunity to become the Qualcomm you know today. Where that's going, that's what needs to happen for our future. If the big companies continue to control, you end up tendency to monopoly, which is what you're worried about. And where the revolution that's going to break that will come from, like the internet and wireless in the 90s, broke the back of IBMs of the world, right? I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. But I know that AI is fundamentally transformative. And if we get quantum computing, it's going to be fundamentally transformative too. And if those lead to new companies growing up that take market space from the Googles and the Meta of the world, you get back to balance. The government also has a role in controlling monopoly, but it's very party dependent. So the Democrats sue Google, and I expect it'll go away with the current administration. So it's complicated.
All right. I think I'm getting dirty looks from the people who make my life possible. So I'm going to call this our last question. But we'll linger a little bit for some light snacks and some drinks at the back. So you'll have more opportunities to ask Bob a question. One more to go here.
Hi, amazing talk, Bob, very thought-provoking. So I'm one of the 75% of foreign graduate students who stayed on in the US, and one thing I'm concerned about is that other graduate students coming in today may not have the opportunities that existed 20 or 30 years ago for two reasons, where one of those reasons is the uncertainty with the new administration about the role of federal funding, especially in the health sciences. The second reason is that now the graduate students at UCSD are unionized. So rather than the policy in the past where it was very easy to change an advisee relationship, now it's incredibly difficult. And if you have a non-performing graduate student, you have to spend multiple months filling out performance enhancement plans and doing a lot of paperwork. So it's much higher risk for a faculty member, even a full professor, to take on a graduate student than it was. Do you see a role for a private philanthropy in de-risking both of those options, both in terms of providing a predictable and sustainable model for students doing research, and also de-risking it for the faculty members who are willing to take on foreign students?
Well, Michael Bloomberg's trying to do that at Johns Hopkins, right? So that's one effort. You know, it's really, the business of unionization at the graduate school level is complicated, and I'm not an expert, so I don't want to speculate too much. I will tell you what the situation is in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. In the STEM fields, more than 50% of the graduate students are from abroad in the United States today. We just looked at the question of Americans applying to graduate school in the STEM fields. In 2023, 2022, the numbers of applicants at the University of Michigan was down 7%. In 2023, post-COVID, it was down 15%. American students applying to go to graduate school in the STEM fields. Unfortunately, Americans don't want to study STEM fields. And foreign students, we have relied on from the 1960s to fill the gap between those who go to grad school, like I did, and the foreign students I went to grad school with in the 1960s. The grad school balance in favor of foreign students over US students is much greater today than it was in the 1960s. And I don't see how to turn that around overnight. You know, the easy thing to say is, well, we've got to get at K through 12. We've been trying to get at K through 12 for 60 years. If it hasn't solved the problem already, it's going to be a long time before the problem gets solved. So I see no approach to sustaining American science and technology at American universities without a more liberal approach to graduate students coming from abroad. I'll leave it at that.
Well, please join me in thanking Bob for this very stimulating talk, and join us at the back of the room here for a little more conversation.